Welcome back. We hope that our first module has deepened your understanding of how the specific tactics of enslavement, land theft, war, the targeting of women, ecocide, ethnic cleansing, and the suppression of lifeways have been deliberately used by dominant powers in order to concentrate wealth. I'm Sarah Bradley, the co-founder and director of education and movement building at Land Justice Futures.
And I'm Kenya Crummell, the director of Black Land and Power at the National Black Food and Justice Alliance, and a member of Land Justice Futures Movement Advisory Council.
While it is important to understand how these methods of domination have been used and continue to be used in the colonization of this land, it is also important to know that throughout history, at every turn, Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color have resisted such harm to themselves, their communities, their culture and lifeways, and the land they love. There is also a legacy of white people and communities joining in such resistance. It is important to learn these stories and find inspiration in them so that we might create new legacies of resistance. For the next 25 minutes, we will revisit the narrative of colonization we have just heard, though this time we will move through it with the lens of resistance. As we read, we ask you to listen for the ways resistors have continually kept life at the center of their actions. On your accompanying worksheet, note specific examples of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color protecting the lives of their communities, the lands to which they are connected, and their culture and lifeways. Write, too, instances where white communities stood in solidarity with these communities and shared in the risk. We begin again.
Indigenous communities, while often hospitable to new arrivals from Europe, have always resisted the theft and colonization of their lands. In the 1670s, for example, Metacom, the son of the Wampanoag chief Massasoit, who had assisted and negotiated a peace treaty with the Pilgrims, organized a pan-Indigenous effort to end the continued encroachment of English settlement on their lands. While the bloody 14-month war that followed, known as the Great Narragansett War, or King Philip's War, resulted in the public execution or enslavement of hundreds of Indigenous people, it remains a powerful example of Indigenous nations coming together to resist colonial powers.
From the beginning of the African slave trade, people who were captured from their homelands found ways to keep their cultures alive. As Dutch enslavers forcibly transported people to the Americas, some African women braided seeds of rice, sorghum, and millet into their hair for their own survival and for the survival of their culture. Of this act of resistance, food sovereignty activist and author Leah Penniman writes, quote,
"Our ancestral grandmothers braided seeds in their hair before being forced to board transatlantic slave ships, believing against the odds in a future of sovereignty on land."
Many people who were enslaved participated in organized rebellions in attempts to end their captivity. The most successful such rebellion was the Haitian Revolution of 1791, in which enslaved people launched an insurrection that resulted in their independence from French colonial rule. The self-liberated Haitians outlawed slavery and inspired subsequent revolts across the globe. The revolution began with a secret ceremony led by Dutty Buckman, who prayed, quote,
God, who has made the sun that shines upon us, that rises from the sea, that makes the storm to roar and governs the thunders, you have seen what the whites have done. Give strength to our arms and courage to our hearts. Sustain us, hearken until liberty.
In the early 1800s, Shawnee brothers Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, I'll start that. In the early 1800s, Shawnee brothers Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa organized a pan-indigenous movement to resist U.S. expansion. Recognizing the government's tactic of creating debt in order to coerce treaties, the brothers and their many followers refused to cooperate with white ways of living. In the community of Prophetstown, they avoided debt by eating only native foods and refusing to drink alcohol. Tecumseh, an amazing orator, traveled and spoke widely about his opposition to treaty signing, saying, quote,
No tribe has the right to sell, even to each other, much less to strangers. Sell a country. Why not sell the air, the great sea, as well as the earth? We gave them forest-clad mountains and valleys full of game. And in return, what did they give our warriors and our women? Rum, trinkets, and a grave.
While Tecumseh and his followers resisted white culture from the outside, other indigenous nations resisted from within. In the late 1820s, for example, the Cherokee brought the state of Georgia to the U.S. Supreme Court, insisting that Georgia did not have the right to divide up Cherokee land and sell it to whites. The Cherokee won their case. Then, President Andrew Jackson chose to ignore the court's ruling and illegally directed the military to remove the Cherokee from their homeland.
It is important to note that some white people resisted the removal of the Cherokee and other nations from their homelands in the Southeast. For example, the educator and writer Catherine Beecher galvanized 1,400 white women to sign petitions against the removal, marking the first time in U.S. history that women appealed collectively to the federal government.
During the era of enslavement, many African Americans resisted by escaping bondage. While many reached emancipation on their own, active efforts to assist escape increased as time went on. The Underground Railroad was a particularly organized approach to aiding freedom seekers, especially after the Fugitive Slave Act was passed. Despite the legal consequences, people of all races, including enslaved and free Black people, Indigenous people, and white people, participated in this widespread form of civil disobedience.
Harriet Tubman, one of the most famous conductors on the Underground Railroad, and who had escaped slavery herself, helped more than 300 people escape to freedom over the course of a decade. She made 19 trips into the South between 1850 and 1860 and claimed to have never lost a passenger. Tubman was a master herbalist who used her knowledge of plants to keep her passengers safe.
As the U.S. government forcibly removed indigenous nations west of the Mississippi, they continued to face fierce and creative resistance. Some Meskwaki and Sauk, for example, refused to leave the home they had made in the Mississippi River Valley. In 1832, rather than move to a reservation, Sauk leader Black Hawk and his band returned to their village of Saukenuk in what is now Rock Island, Illinois. They arrived to find that their village had been infiltrated with white settlers. A 16-week chase by the US military ended in a massacre of 150 Sauk and Meskwaki women, men, and children. Though the massacre convinced many Native nations in the Midwest to sign over their land and move further west, many Meskwaki remained hidden in Iowa. In the 1850s, assisted by white members of the new Iowa government, these Meskwaki purchased 80 acres of their own homeland. In what is now the only indigenous settlement in the country, the Meskwaki now own over 8,000 acres.
In the winter of 1865, 20 Black men, some formerly enslaved, demanded to meet with Union General William T. Sherman to negotiate the implementation of a radical land redistribution plan following the Civil War. The men convinced Sherman to agree to the idea of 40 acres and a mule for each family. And by June 1865, approximately 40,000 formerly enslaved people had settled on about 400,000 acres of land. A few months later, President Andrew Johnson ordered that the land be returned to its former white owners, and federal troops forcibly evacuated the Black families. Despite such theft, by 1890, Black people had purchased over 120,000 farms. By 1910, Black farmers had accumulated nearly 15 million acres, 14% of the nation's farmland.
During the US policy of forced assimilation of Native children, Native people resisted in myriad creative ways. Parents literally hid their children from government agents and social workers so that they would not be taken away to boarding schools. Other families left their homes for a period of time until the rounding up of children had subsided. Sometimes an entire village or tribal group would refuse to hand over their children. In 1895, 19 Hopi men in Arizona were imprisoned on Alcatraz Island for their refusal to give up their children. When children were taken away to boarding schools, elders and family members deliberately spent their children's vacation time teaching them the importance of their stories and traditional ways of life. Students, too, resisted their own imprisonment by running away or refusing to work for the white families to whom they had been leased as servants.
Heroes like Fannie Lou Hamer found multiple ways to resist the unjust system of sharecropping and created just alternatives. When Hamer was young, her job was to keep the official records of the number of bales sharecroppers had picked. Realizing that the plantation owner had fixed the scales to maximize his profits and cheat the farmers, Hamer surreptitiously set the scales right.
In 1969, Hamer, a voting rights and civil rights leader, founded the Freedom Farm Cooperative. I'm going to start that over. In 1969, Hamer, also a voting and civil rights leader, founded the Freedom Farm Cooperative on 40 acres of prime Delta land. Her goal was to empower poor Black farmers and sharecroppers who had suffered at the mercy of white landowners. As noted in the book Farming While Black, the co-op consisted of 1,500 families who planted cash crops and vegetables and grew into a multifaceted organization that provided home building assistance and agricultural training to its members. Believing food sovereignty to be key to liberation, Hamer famously said, quote,
"When you have 400 quarts of food canned for the winter, no one can push you around."
As the government's unjust redlining policy denied mortgages to Black families, those seeking home ownership had to resort to signing predatory land contracts at exorbitant interest rates and minimal legal protections.
The Contract Buyers League in Chicago, a grassroots organization formed by the residents of North Lawndale, emerged in response. The organization advocated for fair and affordable housing rights and played a significant role in raising national awareness about the issue. Their activism ultimately influenced national policy changes, contributing to the passage of the Federal Fair Housing Act of 1968.
While primarily a neighborhood effort, the Contract Buyers League received significant organizational support from the local Catholic Church and the Jesuits.
The rise of Native activism during the 1960s led to the end of the devastating termination policy in which the US government had ended federal tribal recognition. Activists like Ada Deer, a Menominee woman who organized a grassroots movement to advocate for the reinstatement of her tribe's federal status, played a key role in bringing about the reversal of the policy and the 1973 federal bill that restored the sovereignty of many tribal nations.
Such sovereignty has allowed the Menominee Nation to continue to sustainably manage its forest for over 150 years, one of the premier examples of forest management in the world. As Menominee website states, quote,
"The sustainable management of the forest allows us to experience a traditional quality of life from an intact, diverse, productive, and healthy forest ecosystem on the reservation."
all over the country, Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color continue to be at the forefront of a movement that is regenerating land, healing culture, engaging in creative climate justice initiatives, and building food sovereignty. One such example is Soulfire Farm, an Afro-Indigenous centered community farm committed to uprooting racism and seeding sovereignty in the food system. As their website states, quote,
"With deep reverence for the land and wisdom of our ancestors, Soulfire works to reclaim our collective right to belong to the earth and to have agency in the food system."
Soulfire is just one of countless such initiatives taking place all over the country.
In 2016, in a historic gathering, over 10,000 Indigenous people from 200 tribal nations, along with their allies, came together in prayer, community, and resistance on the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation in an attempt to stop the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline. Resilient for over a year, water protectors endured militarized crackdowns, police abuse, and intimidation for protecting the water. While the pipeline was ultimately built, the impacts of the momentous prayerful event have reverberated all over the nation. Indigenous people are leading movements that call for land return, and non-Native people, recognizing the healing power of rematriation, have begun to respond. In this time of ecological crisis and ongoing racial injustice, it is these movements of courageous people who are working to protect and heal their communities, defend and restore the land, and relearn and reclaim their lifeways, who are making a path forward toward a livable future for us all. By joining, supporting, and resourcing these forms of resistance, we are working for our own healing and for the healing of the planet. Yet as we move forward, it will be important to remember that those who resist colonization have always been framed by dominant institutions as radical, unreasonable, uncivil, or even, quote, savage, and have often been blamed and villainized for causing disruption. As we learn how to view history through the eyes of the most oppressed, however, we might prepare ourselves to take a portion. I'm sorry. Do I need to start from the? I messed that
Sure.
up.
That's okay.
Okay. As we learn to view history through the eyes of the most oppressed, however, we might prepare ourselves to take on a portion of the risk inherent in working for a future of healing and wholeness.
Let's all take another deep breath here. This work is about transformation. It takes courage, it takes resilience, and it takes all of us. If you are able, let's take a moment to move our bodies with a little stretch. So together, let's reach up high above ourselves, up to our highest ideals. And then reach down to that which grounds us. And then reach out to the sides to embrace those resistors in gratitude for their courage. Before we move into part 4 reflection questions, we'd like to say a word about moving forward. If you have participated in this training as part of the Focus Community Program or as a part of the Mother Law course, we are excited to continue working with you as you discern how what you have learned today will inform how you incorporate land justice into your lives and the lives of your community. If you have joined this training another way, we encourage you to begin thinking about action items that you and your community can take to support the land justice movement. We now invite you to stop this recording and with your small group, discuss the questions found on the accompanying worksheet. First, how did the resistors choose to keep life at the center of their actions? Second, what risks did the resistors take? Or what harm did they face? Third, while communities of color always risk more than white people when they resist, white communities have at times shared in that risk. Where have you seen this happen? What was the motivation? And then, in what ways is your own community's legacy of resistance to oppressive powers visible to you? In what ways might you be called to repair historical oppression, resist ongoing colonization and racism, and repair relationships now? What risks might we take facing this work? Thank you for joining us in this training. We are honored to be in this work with you. Please don't hesitate to reach out for follow-up and support. Thank you.